So this is what stands between you and a glass of Prosecco in a little while. So we're going to run through these speakers, and so I'd like to introduce the first of them, who is Professor Anthony Smith, UCL Vice Provost for Education and Student Affairs.
Paul, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be able to kick this off, and I do realise that I am just the warm-up act for some very illustrious speakers to follow. But I just wanted to really take 2 minutes of your time for a couple of reflections, really. One is that I think probably, I guess, about 2 years ago, when a few of us started to get excited about what a combination of the strengths of UCL and IOE might look like, this is exactly the kind of thing that we thought about. Real expertise in professional education and the challenges of doing professional formation properly, we could absolutely see in the IOE. And then in UCL, we could see some really world-class work in specific disciplines. And here, of course, we're thinking about engineering. So this coming together for this celebration tonight is fantastic to see as one of the early outcomes of the merger between UCL and the Institute of Education, which took place back in December. So it's fantastic to see this is one of the early, and I'm sure of many outputs from that merger. I think the other one, just to reflect on, is the extraordinary timeliness of actually thinking about engineering education. Some of you, if you're an economist reader, may have seen there was an interesting article last week that's had some interesting facts and figures. It was talking about one of Dyson's initiatives and how he thought he was struggling to recruit to his design and innovation centre in the West Country. But it was backed up by a couple of things. One is that Engineering UK, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, are saying that there's something like a shortfall of 55,000 engineers per year. And also the Institution of Engineering and Technology was saying that in their survey of businesses, was saying that more than half of the businesses were struggling to and could not find the kind of employees that they were looking for. And I think even more than half of those were then saying that they could really see that impacting on their ability to do business in the UK. And I think that for both the employers and academia obviously throws down the gauntlet of a challenge, and it's also an opportunity. And so I think it's not just about producing more engineers, but I think it's also challenges to think differently about engineering education. And I think we'll see that that's exactly the spirit behind the centre, to think differently about engineering education. So I very much look forward to hearing this evening's speakers and really seeing the centre go from strength to strength as it really takes a leadership role nationally and internationally in engineering education. And so with that, I'm delighted to welcome probably one of the two key architects of the merger between UCL and the Institute of Education, and that's the director of the IOE, Professor Chris Husbands, who's now also UCL Vice Provost for Academic Development. Chris.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. So one of my colleagues has a really great question. In the 21st century, he asks, what is not education? We live and work at a time when education and learning are spilling out of organisations, out of schools, out of colleges, out of universities, into our daily lives. We get our information from mobile devices like the one I'm using. We access learning anytime, anywhere, and we expect that learning continues throughout the life course. And for an Institute of Education, it's an almost imperialist line, what is not education? And if that's true, I guess that the engineers amongst you are likely to counter equally that we could ask what is not engineering? given the need for us to find imaginative design and implementation solutions to the tough questions of how we make our societies work. So we have a happy marriage here of two expansive, imperialist, vital fields of enterprise. The Institute of Education has always been interested in learning wherever it happens, however it takes place, and always interested in vocational and professional education. So I'm delighted, as Anthony has said, that one of the first fruits of our relationship with UCL is to be found in this Centre for Engineering Education. I think it speaks to the core of what we're about, the application of education insights to questions of professional formation and engagement, and a recognition that such professional formation has deep roots and is widely spread, spilling from the school classroom to the university laboratory, from the university laboratory to the workplace. I hope that the genuine engagement of social scientists in the IOE with engineers in the Faculty of Engineering enables us to collectively to do something which is unique and significant, not just to get better engineers, but to get a better understanding of how professionals learn, and as a result, further to enhance the quality of professional education. So I'm delighted, as Director of the UCL Institute of Education, to welcome you to this evening's launch, and it's my main function this evening simply to pass the baton on to my relatively new colleague, the UCL Dean of Engineering, Professor Anthony Finkelstein. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I've only just now sort of cottoned on to the full ludicrousness of all of this dance of senior UCL academics. But it's excellent to be here at the launch of this centre. And the launch of this centre is really an achievement for a team who I hope will get other opportunities during the evening to thank. But I certainly want to extend my thanks to Paul, to David, to Paula for the hard work that's brought us here. I'd also like to thank Andrew Cook, an inspired alumnus of this institution who has supported the development of the centre. So why am I excited? Well, I've got really four reasons that I'm excited. The first is that in the UK we aspire to be an innovation and growth economy. But if we are to be an innovation and growth economy, we need engineers. And the primary blockage to that is the shortage of engineers, and any analysis would therefore suggest that it is to engineering education that we must look for a resolution of this. Second, there are major gaps in the way in which we currently provide engineering education. Firstly, we too often, in my judgment, produce engineers who have the knowledge but find themselves unable to actually deploy that knowledge in practical situations. And this is a situation which we need to address. Further, too often, and I will be blunt about this, in the provision of engineering education, we tend to bore our students. Given vast amounts of maths and sciences, often without adequate motivation or understanding of how those are actually to be put into practice. Thirdly, I'm excited because I believe there has arisen too big a gap between vocational education and professional education. I believe that we have evolved almost two separate worlds of education which needs to be brought more close together. Some of you will know that, and I've said this before in other settings, that I did what was then common, was then called a student apprenticeship, as part of my professional training as an engineer. I learnt that, then that I will never be half the engineer of the craftsmen I worked and technicians I worked alongside. And I am personally highly committed to trying to ensure that those educational worlds come closer together. And I hope this is something that's part of the mission of this centre. Lastly, I think it doesn't, can't be said too often, we face a significant challenge around the diversity of our education, of engineering education. Only yesterday I sat at a meeting, in this case of mining engineers, and it was a meeting, it was, the lack of diversity was, I don't know what I can say to fully capture the sense of it. But it is quite clear that if we are to address the skills shortage, surely we must address the diversity challenges around our profession. So I'm looking very much forward to hearing what David Albury has to say. He is both a distinguished expert and a personal friend, and that makes it all the more exciting that I'm here.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony. It's really nice to have my senior colleagues dancing around. That wasn't entirely the intention, but we recognise it's a lot to fit into a short time. So as you can see, I'm Paul Greening. I'm the director of the centre. We've produced a little brochure which is sitting in the bag and maybe causing some discomfort behind your back if you haven't spotted that already. That's pretty much got our sales pitch and our current manifesto in it. So I will, if I may, just draw out a couple of observations from that. Number one of which is that we think the time is right for treating engineering education as a topic for serious scholarship. And we want to work with other colleagues across the sector to really boost the reputation of engineering education as an academic area of excellence. Of course, we're all aware of the really significant skills shortage. Anthony Smith referred to an article this week in the Economist, and I can't deny that that's one of the motivating factors behind setting up this centre. But it's certainly not the only reason. And I think we must also recognise that the engineering profession is changing. We're doing a lot of really good work across the country in primary schools, for example, and I'll plug at this point the fact that we've just gone into a partnership with Primary Engineer to bring some of their brilliant projects to schools in London. But these primary school children who are inspiring now will be joining a profession in 2025, 2030, which is quite different. And I think we need to respond to what skills are required that far down the line. And it may not be the same system that we have at the moment. Our definition of engineering education is purposefully broad and encompassing, and maybe unusually so. So VET, FE, HE, CPD, primary, secondary, tertiary, technicians, apprenticeships. We think there are big challenges across the whole of the landscape, which would benefit from a fresh and joined up approach. And we want to work in all of those areas. Another important point is that this isn't about handing down tablets of stone from Gower Street. I'm sure none of you would dream of such a thing. And I know that one of the themes that David will cover in his talk in a minute is the concept of co-development. We want to work in partnership with you and the wider community. We want to be at the centre of a conversation and an activated community, bringing some fresh thinking to how to attract and train engineers for the 21st century. We hope that we can help to increase the visibility of the wider engineering community and in doing so make UK a world leader in this area. So my message is this: join us, use us, work with us, and dare I say, fund us. Okay, just so you don't have to spend too long looking at the same slide and to sort of respond to any accusations of us being Aravists in this area. That's a view of UCL, of course, from, we think, the mid-19th century, and somewhere we think nestling beneath the portico would be a door that says engineering laboratory on it. and that door would have been there from 1827. So UCL can, I have to be careful exactly how I phrase this, but I think we can have just some justifiable claim to be the oldest engineering education laboratory in England. But we've been around for a while. I think it's fair to say that UCL has been an embodiment of UCL's radical tradition since then, and never more so than recently. Some of you will know, for example, that my home department, civil engineering, caused some tremors when we introduced new programs in 2006, which emphasised the need for engineers to see the bigger picture, and more controversially, an experiment with taking students without physics or maths, or in some cases, both. Which worked, by the way, but that's a topic for another talk. So last year, the engineering faculty introduced an integrated engineering program which placed problem-based learning at the heart of the student experience. So we're still being radical. I should also plug the fact that in the space of about 18 months, we've established what I think we can justifiably claim is a world-leading program of engineering engagement. Over the period of the last year, over 2,500 children and young people from 223 schools have participated in activities and programs with an astonishing 328 members of our faculty involved in those activities. A radical aspect to our engagement activities is that we're insisting on a 50-50 male-female split on all of those. And that's yielding dividends. I know my colleague Elpida, who many of you will know, can tell toe-curling stories about asking schools to send students to be involved in our activities and only sending out the invitation to boys. So we're sending a big message to schools that it's that 50-50 is the way forward. The Centre, more than anything else, builds on our recent relationship with the IOE. For me, this is our USP, our unique selling point, in making us selling point as making engineering education agents of change. Fast forwarding to 2015, and this is very exciting. From 2019, the Centre for Engineering Education will have a new home at UCL East. It's not all of that shaded red area, but we'll be in there somewhere. And our aim is for it to be an inspiring place for educating engineers of the future and to try out new approaches and new partnerships. So that's a quick view of where we are, both literally and metaphorically. To put us in the mood for the challenge ahead, we've invited a special guest speaker tonight to give us an external view on the process of changing models of learning. So I'm pleased to introduce David Albury, who is a board director of Innovations Unit Limited, a leading international support agency for radical innovation in public services. He has, for the last 5 years, been the design and development director of the Global Education Leaders Partnership, working in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, China, and Brazil. And from 2002 to 2005, David was a principal advisor in the Prime Minister's strategy unit. So I'd like to welcome David to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a fantastic privilege to be here today because I believe, as many of the speakers have said, but looking externally, that the Centre for Engineering Education that you're constructing, that you're developing, is a really exciting, but even more critically, a really important initiative. And what I want to do is speak a little bit from the experience I've had over the last few years of leading the design and development of a global education leaders program, which I believe might offer some insights, some reflections, some provocations as to how such a centre might think about the education that it's trying to create in the future. And I suppose it's always good to know that you're not alone. And I don't want to speak about not alone in terms of engineering education, but you're not alone in terms of trying to transform the nature of education, to try to transform the nature of learning. And around the world, there are countries, cities, provinces that are attempting to do something similar to the sorts of work that you're undertaking. And I've just tried to capture on this slide some of the reasons, many of which have already been mentioned as to why this is the case. But I'm just going to draw out perhaps 2 or 3 of them. One of them is around skills gaps and matches, skills mismatches that there are, because often this is seen as a question of shortages, but what's intriguing around the world is actually that there are massive numbers, particularly in a whole host of countries that are copying Western education traditions, of a large number of unemployed graduates who do not have the skills and requirements to take the jobs that are there in engineering and technical professions. So around the world, because this can have quite dramatic consequences, not least as some of the formations of the Arab Spring, some of the unrest in Brazil and so forth, is to do with building expectations through a traditional education system that aren't matched by the needs of the future. What Paul talked about thinking ahead. The students who are sitting in primary schools now will not be engineers next year or even in 10 years' time. They'll be engineers in 20, 30, 40 years' time. And how do we begin to think about this? Secondly, and I'll say a significant amount, I think, later on about this, is the notion that's captured here about disengaged students. Actually, I don't think it's so much that students are disengaged in that education and learning is disengaged from students. It's not the students who are disengaged from the learning that we provide, it's the learning that we provide is often disengaged from the students. And thirdly, the third point I just want to bring out of this is really about the findings from learning sciences. I'm struck, it's a great partnership that you have, and I hope that in drawing on the social scientists in the Institute of Education and beyond, that we'll be able to learn from what's understood now within neurosciences and learning sciences about the nature of learning and how people learn. All too often we find that programs are moving ahead without taking notice of research that exists in a quite different place about how people learn at different stages of their lives. But around the world, as I say, universities, schools, colleges, systems, countries, cities and provinces are attempting to transform their education. And as I said at the beginning, I've had the privilege of being the design and development director of a program that has brought together leaders of education systems and education institutions and education agencies from a host of countries. I think there's probably a dozen listed there. There are now 14 or 15 involved who've been working together for the last 5 or 6 years in trying to collaboratively problem solve how do we change from the education that was effectively built 200 years ago to the sorts of education that we might need in the 21st century. How do we begin to do that? And one of the strange things about this program that I've always liked is that the pitch of it wasn't I and other people coming along saying, we know how to transform your education systems, come on this course or come on this program. The original pitch, the brochure for the Global Education Leaders Program at the beginning was to say, none of us know how to do this, but together we can probably figure out how it should be done. It's a giant collaborative problem-solving enterprise involving teams, 4, 5, 6, often a dozen system leaders from different countries coming together and trying to figure this out. And in this process, of course, there are littered around in all these countries, universities, colleges, schools, further education, vocational training, non-school, non-formal learning activities that are taking place that give us glimpses of what education and learning might be like in the further decades of the 21st century. And out of that, with the help of people from around these different countries, we have distilled a set of design principles. They all take different shape in different places, but they're a sort of set of principles that seem to be in play in these different places, whether they be at a primary or even early years level, or whether they be at advanced continuing professional development level. There's something about the nature of these principles of education that seem to be in place in actually thinking about what sorts of education, what sorts of learning will create the professions, the vocations, the jobs, the citizens of the future. So I just want to say a little bit about these 6 principles. The first one to start at the top is about the way in which this learning is personalised. It's a great event. Don't get me, I want to say this is a great event. But as I look out across this room, I think this is sort of interesting, isn't it? Here we are talking about 21st century education, but there are people sitting in serried ranks, sitting back, listening to some supposed expert, dubious, on the stage talking about something that they presumably have more knowledge than the people who are sitting in the audience, and you should sit there as passive recipients of this great knowledge and then take it away and do something with it. Well, what we find, of course, in most of these new forms of education and learning is that it's not about the delivery by a person to a mass in some way. It's not about believing that there is some standardized form in which this can be delivered, but saying, how do we tune in to the personal motivations and interests? How do we engage learners in formulating their learning plans, their learning journeys in such a way as they have more ownership over that process? How is it that we can create systems in which the learner themselves is at the centre of this and the learner owns their education and owns their learning? So we see in schools, colleges, education, all different forms of learning, this attempt to grapple with how do we do it with large numbers of people in such a way that the individual, the person, is working on what their plan and their journey would be. Not in some sort of classic 1970s way of sort of pictures of computer terminals with individuals sat in front of it, but in a sense of persons collaborating, but collaborating according to their sort of personal learning plans and personal learning journeys. Secondly, as Anthony Finkelstein said earlier on, we also see one of these other developments is away from the notion of a, as it were, a curriculum, an abstract curriculum, that then people think about, well, how do I go about applying that in the world? But actually saying, more and more that these people are working around a sort of form of project-based learning. And I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 specific examples later on. But if we really want people to be great engineers, if we want people to be great professionals, if we want people to be great vocationalists, it's not so much what they know as what they can do with what they know. And this can only be developed, we find, through people working on real-world projects, real things that matter to them in their everyday lives, that mean that they can digest, process, and think about the knowledge in terms of its real-world application from the beginning, not afterwards. And I'm always reminded by a great colleague of mine who was for many years the Secretary of Education in Rio in Brazil, talking about school-level education in the slums of Rio and saying it's no good telling kids there, you know, study maths and Portuguese for 13 years and you might get a job as a plumber. It doesn't relate to their real world. They have to do something that relates to their real world in order for them to understand why that maths and Portuguese or whatever it might be important to them later on. So there's something about that sort of real-world integrated application that's important. Thirdly, and relatedly, is this sense, and Chris mentioned this, and several of the speakers mentioned this, all too often we've seen education as something that exists within institutional settings, as something that, as it were, happens when somebody comes into a building, not quite a building such as this, but comes into a set of facilities and buildings that are labelled a school, a college, a university. And again, as we look around the world at these different models that people are developing in different places at different levels, all of them in some way reach out to and connect with the community. They see the community as an integrated part of the education, an integrated part of their learning. So it's fabulous, it seems to me, that in the room today, it's not just people who are educators and engineers within the academic setting or within an educational setting, but people from employers' federations, from different sorts of organisations and agencies. Those sorts of people, it's critical if there is to be a really new form of education that really integrates professional formation with real-world learning, it seems to me that it connects to the community. Fourthly, and perhaps this gets more controversial in some sense, though I'm intrigued about it, of course, if we really look at some of these issues, then we find that in these places around the world, again, there's as much peer-to-peer learning, or even student-to-teacher learning, heaven forbid, student-to-teacher learning that takes place as there is, as it were, teacher-to-student. What characterises these new institutions, these new organisations, these new forms of learning is that they are all learners and researchers together. They are people in a community researching and learning together. They might have different levels of expertise at different points, but there's this sense of a co-created, an emancipation of the potential of learners as co-designers and peer-to-peer supporters. So those are the sort of 4 principles. There's then 2 others that are in a sort of slightly different place, and we deliberately put them in a different place. I'll take the easier one first, perhaps, which is about the nature of the teaching profession, if we can call it that for now, which is that it's often been a very individualized occupation. It's been one, it's sort of, some people talk about it as a sort of craft occupation where the individual teacher is at the center of it. And what we see in these different forms of learning around the world is more and more a sense of a collaboration between between teachers in order to think about and to co-design and to co-create the sorts of courses and programs and learning experiences that be important for students. And they deliberately make time for it. And again, I'll draw out an example in a moment. And lastly, and I think this is in one sense the hardest to get around and easy to get wrong. There's many people, when they think about education for the 21st or 22nd century, gravitate to a place that talks about technology. And technology is a really important, in all these places around the world, these different examples, technology is always important. But it's sort of not the driver. It's sort of invisible in the process. And the example that was given to me by actually a colleague in South Africa was to say, if someone came to you and asked you to describe your house, you wouldn't start talking about the plumbing and the wiring. You'd talk about its functions and the way that it's organised and the sort of layouts and so on. Of course, you can't have a modern house really without plumbing and wiring. In the same way, you can't really have 21st century learning and the availability of all those worldwide and global resources. But it's not the technology itself, it's the way in which we think about those teaching and learning practices and the way in which they can harness the potential of technology that's important. So, I then thought, well, I'll just say a word or two about 2 or 3 examples, just because I like them, and they're examples drawn from different places. There's 2 schools and 1 college, just for the sake of it. I thought you'd know more about universities probably than I do, so I'm on safer ground with this, at least with some of you. So I just wanted to say something on this. So I like High Tech High. It's a group of schools in Southern California, treating a very diverse range of students. It's entirely a project-based curriculum. There is no subject curriculum in High Tech High. The job of the teachers is to build foundational knowledge out of the projects that the students choose to work on from the ages of 11 onwards. What's interesting is Larry Rosenstock, the great originator of High Tech High, a very flamboyant person, would say he doesn't really care, it's not quite true, but he doesn't really care about end of school results. He cares about what those children can do in colleges, in universities, in careers and employment later on. They happen to do completely okay. Right? They happen to do completely okay in end of school tests. But more interesting still, because they've been doing projects, because they've been doing research, because they've been doing critical problem solving, because they've been collaborating, because they've been in teams, from the age of 11 working on these things, the Harvards, the Stanfords, the Yales, the MITs search out these students from this bunch of schools because they know that they have those sets of skills that are really going to put them in place, not just in higher education, but employment. But it's entirely project. They do a project every 6 months, every sort of semester, High Tech High. Group of students do the projects together, and the job of the teachers is to build around those projects the foundational knowledges that those students need. Take it because it's a very sort of pure example of project-based learning, and it can be done. And this is a sort of little picture, and it doesn't look like an ordinary school, it looks more like an engineering laboratory that's going on in High Tech High in Southern California. The second I chose because it's going to sit right next to you in the Olympic Park. So it seemed to be a good place to start. It's a school, a free school that was started some 2.5 years ago, School 21, and I've just plucked out of that the 6 values that underpin School 21, so these are slightly different, it seems to me, from a traditional school. They talk about craftsmanship. Craftsmanship's a really important thing. Most of us in our work don't sort of go, well, we'll just write something or just make something and then that's it. We think about different sorts of products. So in this school, all the students from the age of 4 go through a process of iteration of different drafts of products or projects or essays or whatever. They use the students from the age of 4 to mutually critique that work and to build it up. You should go and see the fantastic work that's produced by the kids, through all the kids, not just some, not just the brightest, all the kids through this process. They focus on oracy. They worry about literacy and numeracy, of course, but we know that speaking fluently with confidence is a really important part. So they have that. They have about expertise, about spark, always asking, about professionalism, about grit. And why do I choose these? Because actually these sets of values that underpin 21st century education often seem to me quite important. And then lastly, which some of you may well be familiar with, is School of Communication Arts, an advertising school, a professional vocational school. What do I like about this? If you ask them what their curriculum is an evolving living document created by the industry itself. It's a wiki. It sits there all the time. Anyone who is part of the advertising industry can put into play different ideas, different processes, different resources, different models in that place. So I take 3 really extreme examples to pull them out, not because I'm offering, you must only you can know about education and engineering in a context that I never could. But those are some of the examples that I hope might provoke some thoughts about what you might both research and do in the work of the centre. This is sort of, I don't want to say much more about this, you've probably heard enough from me. This was a piece of work, again, done within one of the offshoots of the Global Education Leaders Programme that just looked at trends in professional learning and performance development around the world. Again, that word about integrated, immersive was the word there. That's more about the real world experience, about connected. The importance of design, which is why I think, personally, you'd know better than me, personally I think probably engineering education might well lead the way of what education looks like in the 21st century. It might have a lot of interesting feedback into the other work of the Institute of Education about thinking, given the design focus of it, how important it is. Tends to be market-led. I'm not talking about privatisation, but notions about choice and multiple providers. You sit in a very important global, world-leading institution or set of institutions. Increasingly, students around the world are picking and choosing elements from different institutions and different settings to put together into their plan. How do we think about this? And inevitably, it's pretty open in that process. So, and then, and I'm definitely not going to go through this, don't worry about it, it's just a sense of the neat thing about this, I just love this, it's only because I love this piece of research, truthfully, is that having done all this work in these different settings, in different levels of education, in different countries, in different locations, we were trying to understand here what the elements were that enable people to transform from one form of education to another. How did they transform from something that was effectively built in the 19th century to something that's appropriate to 21st or 22nd century? And this, in case you're interested, was the sort of, as we distilled it all, there were sort of 16 elements that were in common around this, though the sequence and the pathways and relationships were very different. I just want to say one piece which is around this area, which is the area labelled education. Which is, it does seem to me that it's not just about the curriculum, or it's not just about pedagogy, the methods of teaching and learning, and it's not just about assessment practices, it's about the totality of those 3, if we're really going to transform education and learning to be really help the young people of today and tomorrow survive and thrive in the coming centuries. And interestingly, just to say a word about this in relation to the example of high-tech high, the other bit, again common in many places around the world, is if you ask high-tech high, as a group of schools, how is the student's work assessed? They'd say it's assessed by the students, the community, the parents, potential employers, and so on. The teachers don't mark the work. The performance-based assessment is a critical part of this. And of course that drives, again, the students to very high standards what they're presenting to their peers, not to some abstract authority person or whatever it might be. So there's something in that that's, I think, is really important in terms of perhaps, as we researchers, I know you will, the future of engineering education in this country. And then I was just trying to think, as a way of bringing this to a close, about saying, from all the privilege I've had of sitting alongside the transformational journeys that other organisations and institutions have made, what is it that they've sort of kept in play to do this? They haven't done it on their own. None of these places have created new forms of education by, as it were, looking inwards. They've always looked outwards. And they've not done it by, as it were, just sort of the odd bit of engagement. They've done it by really relating to, seems to me, 5 sets here, which, as I know, all the areas that you want to look at. It's about looking out to communities. I'd suggest lots of these places that develop these great ideas and great models have done it with their students. That is, they haven't gone away and thought as a group of teachers, how do we do it? They've engaged with their students and thinking about it. They certainly engage with employers and the professions, with schools. But there's also something about, I'm just leaning back onto what Paul said earlier on, about that sense of the what things will be like in 2050. And there's always a danger that we listen most to the oldest, the usual suspects, the most incumbent industries and sectors, rather than thinking, where is the growth and what is it likely to be, and how do we connect with the sort of startups, the emerging, the growth sectors of the economy. And because I was always taught when I was an academic that no good lecture or presentation should have more than 3 key learning points, I thought I should have perhaps leave with 3 possible learning points from this. One is, in all these experiences, it seems to me, it's been much more about co-design than consultation. It's not about getting a plan and sending it out to people and saying, what do you think of it? It's how do we create processes that really can create great forms, powerful forms, effective forms of learning together. Secondly, as I've already said, it's about new growth sectors and startups. It's not just about usual suspects. It's about working with them in a way to put this. And thirdly, was just a puzzle that I had in my head as I was thinking about this. You have 2 world-leading institutions that have come together to create something that could be of immense global significance. And one of the reasons it could be of that is because of scale. The fact that you have scale is really important. The fact that you have reach is really important. And there's just one bit of a sort of interesting part about organisations that grow at scale is they can tend to become very sclerotic in the process. So whilst the ambition must be scale, I'd suggest openness is really important to allow that porosity of ideas, that openness to ideas from outside that will be the lifeblood. So I hope I might have said something along the way that is of value or of provocation or of reflection to you, and I wish the Centre and all of you the very best with your future. So thank you for listening to me.
Good evening, everybody. I'm David Guile. I'm just going to host the questions to David, and in a few minutes' time after those have been exhausted, a couple of quick questions to Anthony and Paul, who are going to join David on the top table. So could I invite you to ask a question? It would be really helpful if you just said who you were, so that David has a sense of, you know, what the question is, but also what maybe the background to the question before he comes to construct his answer. So who might like to kick off? And Paula will come and give you the microphone so that you can be heard right up the front nice and clearly. Right, we have a starting question. Thank you very much, Matthew.
Hello, David. My name is Matthew Harrison. I'm an engineer and an educator of engineers. And my observation of the state of engineering education, certainly in the UK and possibly globally, is that some fantastic work going on, but it seems to be in pockets. And each of those pockets can be at a reasonable scale, because often they're backed by large institutions. In your work abroad, bringing together different folks with their different perspectives and their different scale, what can you tell us about that process to enable the centre to be a magnet for collaboration?
So, again, you might be pleased to know that this isn't a peculiar problem for engineering education. It's a problem in many sectors. It has the nice technical problem about the rates of diffusion of innovation and good practices across different sectors. And I have a very long answer, so I'm trying to keep it into a very short answer. I think there's... one of the things that fascinates me in the Global Education Leaders Programme is when we go to a country that says that it wants to join, or a city that says it wants to join, is often at some point it'll generally be the Minister of Higher Education or the Minister of Education or a senior official will say, halfway through the conversation, I'll say something like, how long does this transformation business take? Right? And most of them are thinking, you know, I've got an election in 3 years' time, and my answer has always been, it took us sort of 150 years to build the current one. It will probably take us a few decades to build the new one. And the other part of that is to say there's lots we know about what doesn't work in terms of scaling and spread. For those who are interested in the research, conferences, workshops, training seminars, pamphlets, websites are all pretty limited effectiveness, so it's not there. What's more interesting is that it's more like a sort of social movement is what we're trying to create. That is, it's something where, and the elements of social movement is quite interesting, that's the only bit I'm going to say really now, which is that having a really profound case for change, having a real understanding of why it needs to, why education, why learning, why engineering education needs to change is really important, which is why my first slide is there, in a sense, is to say, it's not just a nice to have, actually there's a lot of urgency around the world, and as I say, actually, the worst bits for me are going to somewhere like a country, but not naming a country, and seeing the sort of, in one sense, the best of 19th or 20th century engineering education in place, and huge gaps between the graduates that are being produced and the vacancies, and huge social unrest around that. We have to create great social movements come out of a great compelling case for change, a vision of what's possible, and then a multitude of ways in which people can, in collaboration, participate in that. So often we say, there's good and there's bad, or they're on the way to transformation and they're not. And actually my experience is within every setting there are individuals who are keen to join with us in that journey to some new form of learning. We need to be a bit more like a sort of movement or a campaign than a sort of government policy. I guess I can say this having spent many years in government policy. We need to be thinking more in that sort of frame. How can the Centre for Engineering Education be the nucleus of a global movement that will really transform engineering education?
Right, thank you. Paul, I thought Michael was slightly further forward.
I'm Michael Young, at the Institute of Education, sociologist and former chemist. Just to pick up on David's point about the importance of learning, which you focused on throughout your thing, it seems to me that if we're serious about learning, that raises a whole lot of questions about new forms of collaboration between specialists, and particularly new forms of specialized knowledge. One of the examples I was thinking of was in fact, the areas like biomedical engineering and biotechnology. Now, that's suddenly bringing people together who've not worked together before. And that seems to be happening in industry in certain areas. And I wondered what impact you thought it would have for the preparing our engineers of the future, if they're suddenly going to find themselves, in a sense, not just in the mining sector, but also in doing very detailed investigations in the area of biotechnology?
I'm sure there are people in this room much, much better qualified to answer this question than I am. But let me just offer two observations. I mentioned the word about personalisation earlier on. And there's a huge debate, I'm sure you're aware of it, Michael, in the literature. One of which says personalisation is about everyone taking different routes to the same sort of common core of subjects and understanding. And I guess much of what's developed is around that sort of space, that how do we find these different pathways according to different developmental predilections that people might or might not have. And then there's another school of thought, and the most sort of outrageous end of that is the writings of a guy who I like a lot, Yong Zhao, who talks about creating unique learners, who says actually people all have different potentials and might have different specialisms, and why do we require everyone to go through a process where, you know, there's this set of subjects and everyone has to have it, and that allows some specialism. So some part of me is sort of intrigued really about this question. The only bit that I'm even on more dangerous ground now is I'm always a bit wary of over-specialisation, because these specialisms, if we take a reasonable sort of historical trajectory on them, appear and disappear actually at a significantly rapid rate. And I go back then to saying, it's like, what do we really want out of learning? Well, the two things we really would like for our students and for our children is probably that they really want to learn, that they have a desire to learn. And it's sort of tragic that nearly all of them have that aged 3 and 4, and most of them have it beaten out of them by the time they're 15 or 16. And secondly is the capacity to learn. And the capacity to learn is something that's, it's not totally transferable, but it is important. So it's like, and I get very worried about this in the sort of vocational streaming sorts of arguments that say, okay, somebody aged 12 says they want to be a plumber and, you know, right, we'll build off their notion of that. You've got to create some breadth, some flexibility and some capacity to learn so that when there's a glut of plumbers that they can go off and do something else. So I just need to think some more about the sort of hyper-specialisation in the professional market, about what that actually means. But I sort of still feel flexibility and capacity to learn is pretty important.
Right. There's a couple of questions right by you and behind you, actually, Paula. 1, 2, and one over the far side.
Thank you. My name's Andrew Lamb. I'm a consultant and have recently been working on a project called The Global Dimension in Engineering Education, which is a European project looking at issues of international development, global development. A lot of what gets taught in engineering courses at the moment is the cause of many of the world's problems, like climate change, inequality, poverty, social injustice. And, you know, if you feed young engineers this diet of carbon and combustion, steel and silicon, all these toxic substances, no wonder the world's getting more polluted. And, you know. So one of the what I'm interested in is changing the content of engineering education, not just the process of engineering education. And I wonder if you could give some examples of how content can be changed, not just the process of learning, but the content can be changed and the barriers to that from your experience.
Well, I'm going to just give one interesting sort of example you might want to follow up. I feel as though the question's trying to take me onto more and more dangerous ground.
Right, well,
so the example is in British Columbia, where there's a fascinating collaboration between universities and schools about what the nature of the curriculum would be. And what's interesting there, and I think is, I mean, Chris probably knows more about this than I do, but almost certainly does, but I think the trends towards some form of competency-based curriculum rather than subject-based curriculum is really key. This goes back to, it's not so much what you know, of course you have to know something, but it's what you can do with what you know that's really important. So, you know, you can go onto the Ministry of Education British Columbia website, and there's a sort of really interesting example of different thinking about what those competencies might be that take you into a different place, because they are about issues about environmental sustainability, they're about respect, they're about a whole set of things that construct the syllabus as much as whether somebody can do a particular piece of well, there's actually no piece of trigonometry in it, but some particular piece of trigonometry that might be important or other. So I think there's something about competence which is really key in this.
In light of David's observation, I was about not wanting to be dragged completely into dangerous territory. Okay, Anthony and Paul, would you like to come and join us? So if some of the questions actually do stray more specifically into the direction of the engineering curriculum.
Give them the dangerous ones.
You can pass them between you.
Yeah.
Paul, I think it was Anne in front of you, and there's a couple of hands back on the left-hand side, and then there's another one at the front there. Okay, so should we just take Anne's question first, and the gentleman in front, okay, and then the two people at the back. If we take the two questions together, yeah, and try and then give the panel an opportunity to kind of talk, reply across the questions. So.
Okay, I'm Anne Hodgson from the Institute of Education. I'm a professor in post-compulsory education. That's where my expertise lies. I was very interested in the third point that you made about scale. I actually thought you were going to say something else there, and my question relates to that. I thought you were going to say something about starting small. And really, my question is about how do you get something started? Is it better to have a whole load of small-scale things going on at the same time, or to think about 3 or 4 major projects? You know, what would you advise a centre like this to start off with?
Right, great. And can we take the other question as well, please, Paula, and so that we get all the panel in, as people can. So the,
Hello, Simon Guest from the University of Cambridge. I'm an engineer, and engineering is a vocational subject. How do we engage commercial organisations in this vision that you have? And my question is partly predicated on something Professor Finkelstein said about his student apprenticeship. So in Cambridge, 20 years ago, half of our students would have done a student apprenticeship. Now it's less than 10%. Now, how do we engage commercial organisations in this vision of education that we have? Because ultimately, if we're doing engineering education, engineering is a vocational subject, people are going to want to work in commercial organisations because that's primarily where engineering gets done.
Okay. Right, David, would you like to kick off to Anne, and then Paul and Anthony and you can kind of pick up other themes around the other question?
Well, and I definitely, I mean, all the work that that the Innovation Unit does, which I'm proud to be a director of, says start small, prototype, do all these things are really important if we're trying to create something radically new. But sort of do it, this is going to sound weird, but sort of do it on a large scale. The great thing about prototyping things is you can involve lots of people in doing very small things. You can involve lots of people in doing very small things. And that's the secret of lots of social movements. They involve lots of people in doing very small things. And being able to test those out and refine them and develop them is really important. And if you buy, and there's no reason why you should, but if you buy my sort of line that wouldn't it be great if the centre was the sort of energizer, the catalyst of a global movement to change engineering education, which is a pretty grandiose thing, but if it could seed a number of sort of small ideas that lots of people were working on, I think it would begin to create a real mass. But one of the secrets of that, of course, is that, and this just strays a little into sort of more innovation theories, great radical transformations come about through being able to integrate a whole set of smaller scale innovations along the way. So at some point you need some integrators, and the centre is fantastically well placed to be able to do that. Say, oh, that's really interesting what we're learning over there, and if we put it with that and so on. So I'd sort of say about some bits about starting small are important, but with large numbers of people.
I'm going to actually pick up the other question, which is about the relationship with employers. I was very taken by David's point about moving from consultation towards co-creation, and I think we need to radically reshape the nature of our dialogue with employers. I mean, I have to say that on the whole, I've been very, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I mean, I've been very disappointed with the ways in which we've been able to engage with employers in the shaping of undergraduate curricula. And I think that we have to start somewhere else. And I also think that there is some serious steps that need to be taken by employers to think about the extent of the resources they are going to need to supply into that process if we are genuinely to address the skills problems which they so vociferously complain about. So yes, I think there is there's something to do. On an aside about about the question about student apprentices, I think it's very interesting observation. We lost all the thin sandwich courses in the UK because it's a major part of engineering education, because employers would not pay basically for that, and that we have the results that we can see now in the shape of the engineering profession. So there's some serious back to the drawing board about those relationships.
I literally couldn't say that better than Anthony. Yeah, I think you've got to the nub of one of the important issues there, Simon. We need to find a way of engaging with the people who are employing the engineers that we're educating, and we need to prove our relevance to them. And an event like today is a part of the process of trying to be seen to be relevant. But there's a lot more work to be done going forward.
David?
Just one footnote on this. I was very struck by what Anthony said about curriculum. Generally around the world, if you go to places and ask people what would they change about the curriculum, or what would they change about the present, they generally say not very much, or would just like more of the same, or whatever. I think that one of the other bits is to start the co-design or the conversation about outcomes. What are the sorts of people that we are trying to create? And then draw it back from that to what does the nature of the curriculum or assessment or whatever need to be. That if one starts with the curriculum, it's sort of like, well, I did my sort of maths and physics and so on, so that must be what other people need, and so because that's the experience people have to draw on. If we say, what is it that we're trying to create for the future, sometimes that engenders a different sort of dialogue.
I mean, I'll also, I've been risky so far, I'm going to be a bit further, go further, which is one of the challenges about the dialogue with employers at the moment, is that there's something unsaid on the table. And what's unsaid is that we have 4 years and we need 5. And so, I don't think the space available for the current MEng programs is long enough, given the state of preparedness that students come to us from secondary education. So that may well mean a dialogue that goes well beyond the... exactly.
Yeah. Paul, there's a couple of questions about people waiting over there. They're waving their hands. Perhaps they come next. And we'll take both of those first, please.
Thank you. I think I've forgotten my question now, but I'll see if I can remember as I'm talking. My name is Brian Bowe. I'm from the Dublin Institute of Technology. I suppose my question would be for all of the panel. You could all comment on this. Within our own institute, I'm responsible for education innovation within engineering, and also for quality assurance and education research and so on. But one thing I've noticed within our own institute, but also within our partners' institutions across the world, is that engineering education innovations tend, if not always, in the vast majority of cases, be driven from the bottom up. It tends to be academics, faculty members, lecturers, teachers, whatever we call them, who want to do something different, who are frustrated with the teaching approach that they're using or their students' engagement, and they do something different. But very often what can happen then is, and we have found this, is eventually senior management get their hands on it. And one of the characteristics that all of the innovations share is that they are messy. They're unstructured. It's not as clean as it was when it was all lecture-based and tutorials and labs and so on. And now it's messier and it's harder to do and it's hard to stand over. And then senior management get involved and say, okay, this is great. This is a great approach. We like it. And then it becomes structured and it becomes something that you can basically take off a shelf. And a very good example of this is problem-based learning. Problem-based learning was developed as a very student-centered pedagogical approach to deal with problems with medical students. But then what happened was senior management took over, and now you can buy a problem-based learning curricula. And you can buy this, and it tells you exactly what to do. It tells every staff member, every tutor, exactly the questions to ask, and it tells students exactly what to do. So it's no longer student-centered, but people still say they're doing innovation when it's not anymore. It's just a comment to see if that's something as you've looked at international trends, if that's something you've noticed. Thank you.
Can you take the other question as well, please, Paula? The person at the side there, I think.
I'm Celia Hoyles. I'm Professor of Mathematics at the Institute of Education, and I'm also President of the Institute of Mathematics and its Applications. I sit on various boards with various engineering learning societies. And one of the things that they always say is about the image of engineering, and this is what they've got to change in order to broaden access. And one of the big things about, as you all know, is the gender representation. And so you do have to wonder why we do have speakers that are men. And this does happen rather a lot with engineering. And I'm not sure there must be women around who can speak in this way. And I was very recently at another one, a very important learning society for engineering. And again, we were up against this. And everybody said we needed more women, but it was all men saying this. I am not an engineer, but I do think it's quite important. And in mathematics, we have the similar sorts of problems. We have to make sure that engineering is the community that people want to join. And all the initiatives that you've talked about are fantastic, and they will do that. But you just have to make sure that the external image of the centre is one that will attract everybody. Thank you.
Right, thanks. Right, okay. Right, panel. We've got some interesting questions to respond to there. Who'd like to start? Oh, they're shy.
I mean, okay. Yeah. So hands up, you know, on the question of gender representation, because we could do nothing else. What I would say is that UCL Engineering has the highest representation of women of any academic of any engineering faculty in the UK, and also the highest number of women engineering professors. So we're doing our little bit, and probably we know we need to do more. When I saw the statistics first, I announced it on Twitter, and the first thing I got back was, "Well done, Anthony, first loser," which was, I thought, fair enough. The question about senior management inhibiting innovation in engineering education, tempts me, of course, to a sarcastic reply and say, of course, it's not deans, it's all vice provosts who are to blame. But what I would say is that there is increasingly a problem of the tools which we use for curriculum design. That may be overly constraining, and I mean in part the structural tools we use to build curricula. That is the notion of modules and certain classes of evaluation structure. But I do also mean here the way in which we record things, that is student record systems and so on and so forth, which actually do often structurally inhibit some of the innovations I think we would like to see.
On your point, Brian, I think your question was, do I recognise what you say? And yes, I do recognise what you say. I think we've got a challenge on our hands if we're going to try and put ourselves in the position of being a part of a UK community where we're trying to bring in a whole bunch of partners to try and give advice to policymakers about how to do things differently. We need to watch out for those sort of pitfalls of small incremental change which have sort of petered out for various management reasons. We need to be sort of ambitious enough to try and get over those sort of hurdles.
Thank you. My name is Oliver Broadbent. I'm director of ThinkUp. We're an engineering education design consultants. It struck me, we often associate engineering with superlatives, tallest, fastest, all this sort of stuff. And I'm always looking at how do we motivate the kind of learning we need for the sort of engineers we want. And then this Christmas, rereading Small is Beautiful, the penny dropped. What about the engineer in the service of communities? What about the engineer helping to deal with climate change and resilience at a community level? Because we still need energy at community level, we need resources. And I'm interested to know the panel's view on, could we actually switch engineering education to be more in the service of the community at a small scale? Then things can be learner-centred, then things can be targeted towards real human needs.
Okay, what? So
hello, I'm Zoe Laughlin, the Creative Director of the Institute of Making at UCL. We saw the slide with UCL East and the little area in red, and the proposition for the Centre for Engineering Education having its own fantastic space. But that's a sort of hopefully 4 to 5 years time thing, and I wondered if you could mention any of the challenges and opportunities that this period of time between then and now offer.
Right, thanks. And finally, Paula, person at the front. Yeah.
So hi, I'm Catherine Holloway. I'm a lecturer in civil engineering. So I had 2 quick points. One was to do with the colleague from DIT saying about the problem with problem-based learning and how people like Anthony destroy it. But actually, I wonder if some of it links back to our accreditation processes. And engineering can be quite top-down in that regard. And having just going through my first ever, being a relatively young academic, trying to get my new MSc accredited, none of my stuff fits into the boxes they want at all, so I keep having to switch and change and ask how that will work. And the second point actually follows up on the communities thing, which was just to say that when I did work in industry in big companies, there didn't seem to be any particular drive to really want to change engineering education because they wanted to keep the expertise in-house and not particularly want to go and give it away to universities so that the universities could then possibly train engineers to go elsewhere. And so I personally would be of the view of switching to communities.
Right, can we just take a quick... Yes, I thought we'd take quick ones and then
okay, I'm going to do this incredible question. Oliver, yeah, good point. Good. There's a study in that, I think. Zoe, it's a real challenge building towards setting up somewhere in 5 years' time. And I think the key thing is building up relationships, and you'll recognise that as well. I think when we touch down in 2019, we need to already be there, if that doesn't sound a bit odd. So I think building relationships is the way forward. Catherine, accreditation, I'm not sure if there's anybody here from the accrediting bodies, the Engineering Council. My experience from a previous round in the same department as you was that they weren't the ogres that sometimes we make them out to be, and in fact were very, very helpful. And that's been my personal experience, but it's not without potential for pitfalls, maybe.
Anthony,
I'd just say the biggest project you could probably do would be to co-design the centre for 2019 and get lots of people engaged. And there could be as much about the communities that surround, small-scale communities that surround the Olympic Park and so forth as they could, which is why, big plug, School 21, go and sort of connect with those or whatever. But I think that if you could involve all those people in making that that itself would start to be a transformation of engineering education. So that's just a hunch.
So I want to pick up Catherine, because I think that, maybe we can make the professional institutions part of the solution to some of this. Maybe, and maybe what we need to do is re-own the professional, move them back to the member bodies they should really be, use them as the driver for the co-creation, move them as the bottom-up vehicle for peer-based engagement within the seeds of those professional institutions, and let us not forget learned societies. Maybe there's something. Maybe the tools are. Maybe the tools are there. And so, if we rebuild the professional institutions, maybe that's part of rebuilding engineering education.
Okay, and finally,
my name is Andrew Cook. I'm provided some of the money to establish this centre. And I have one observation and one question. My observation is that, as Professor Finkelstein said, the objective is to close the divide between what you might call academic engineering and practical engineering. I listened as carefully as I could to Mr. Albury's presentation, but I didn't find the answer there in his many hexagonal generalities. So I will suggest a more simple answer of my own. One is that you must pay them more. Industry has to pay them more to make it attractive financially to become an engineer. And one mechanism for doing that, which is not something in which you can directly engage, is for government to give a financial incentive through rebates to corporation tax. Not grants, rebates to taxes on profits. The second thing, and this is the role of academe that you have to do, is you have to make it interesting. Most engineers who excel in life have come the Professor Finkelstein route, done engineering apprenticeships, what they used to call the premium apprenticeship, in fact, which before the war your father or a rich uncle or somebody had to pay the company for you to do. It has to be interesting because it has to be interesting, it has to be practical and relate to the real world. So that is my observation. My question, which is to Mr. Albury, is this. There were two flags I could not recognize. One was the rather squashed Union Jack and the rising sun, and the other was the strange flag in the top right-hand corner of your slide, which was basically white with some diagonal flashes on it. Which nations do these flags represent?
I'll have to go back to the slide and look for you, Aaron. So I'll go back afterwards and have a look at which those slides were.
Okay, right. Well, look,
Can I?
yes, because of cut. Just going to say one last line across the panel. Anybody, Paul? Anything? Or are you happy to?
I heard the champagne corks popping about half an hour ago. I'm as eager as any of you.
Okay. Paul's priorities are very clear. Anthony.
Two things, two interesting things. One is really interesting political dialogue going on right now, bit drowned out about apprenticeships, with the new announcement also about degree apprenticeships. I think there's some interesting things going on in that space, so there is some potential for political movement around that. There is, at the heart of the supply problem around engineering, remains this very interesting dilemma about why, despite the complaints about skills shortages, the salaries have not moved in quite the way we would expect. And there remains an economic question about what exactly is going on there. So I think there's research to be done to really understand why we've got simultaneously many reports of skills shortages and not the escalation in quite the escalation in salaries we would expect, despite the reasonably high outturn. So, interesting data question.
Right. Before I invite you to thank everybody for their contributions, just one quick message from me, which I hope, Alan, will be a way the Centre can address what the challenge you've just posed. Also, it builds on David's point about co-design, many of the other things that Paul and Anthony have said in their contributions. We thought what could be the first sort of footprint that the Centre could have. We've decided to call it the Centre for Education and Engineering and Education Conversation Series. And the idea is to try to actually do all those things that David's describing, co-design it between all the participants who we hope will join us. To kick-start, though, we are going to take the theme of apprenticeship for the reasons I think that you've just been referring to, Anthony, and that also kind of emanated from Alan's question. And we will hopefully be able to announce after the election, we feel it's possibly a little bit ill-advised to do so beforehand, who the two speakers will be, but I guarantee you one will be from the world of employment and one will be from the world of educational research around the theme of apprenticeship. And the idea is that they'll come together to explore issues. That's the idea of the conversation. So we hope we're going to be able to model all the things we've actually been saying throughout the course of this evening. So on that note, I will say please do thank everybody who's contributed, including Anthony and Chris, and the three members of the speakers who are on the panel at the moment. Thank you all very much. Please retire and have a drink and continue conversations outside.
Good, I'm pleased. And I'd love